Thank you all, and thank you so much, Gail. And as Gail mentioned, I'm a recovering government employee. I now work at a nonprofit, but my experience with government was actually quite amazing. I had an opportunity at a young age. When I was 14 years old, I started working in local government through a youth employment program. But I had this opportunity, this transformative opportunity to learn what it's like to have a voice in government, to have people listen to me, to respect me as a young mind and leader. And so that's what I fell in love with, and that's what I've done in my career, and that's what transitioned me to this organization now, which is the Participatory Budgeting Project, which is a new organization, new-ish. It was founded in 2009 and incorporated in 2011 with a mission of helping people spend portions of public budgets. So it is, again, this idea that people matter, that individuals' voice matters, not only for the idea or the sake of having a voice, but for making communities better, for making government better. So my work now is really around reshaping and redefining the ways in which we practice democracy. And it's really exciting for me, and some of you may be familiar with what participatory budgeting is, but I'll pause for a moment so that you can see a summarized video of how we practice participatory budgeting in the United States.
Right, if you live in this community and you pay taxes, come out and vote, decide how your tax dollars get spent.
Participatory budgeting gives people real power over real money to make the decisions that affect their lives. It's a democratic process in which ordinary community members directly decide how to spend part of the public budget.
Oh, this is different because you're actually voting for where the money is going to be spent instead of allowing them to decide where to spend the money.
Who knows better about their community than the people that live in their community?
Not be afraid of the big words, participatory budgeting. It sounds boring, but it's the opposite of that.
So how does it work? First, people brainstorm ideas. They come together in meetings and assemblies and start to think of what kinds of projects they would like to see in their neighborhood.
We had to think big. We have $1 million that we could use, so we can fund parks, health issues, streets.
Volunteers work with experts to turn people's initial ideas into full project proposals.
We started with maybe about 40 projects, and so we had a series of budget delegate meetings, and we narrowed down the list into about 4 or 5 projects.
We met with the Parks Department and we talked about what we wanted to see change in some of the parks and how we were going to work with them.
What are the real needs in the community? If you only have a certain amount of money, what is it that you can do that's going to benefit as many people as possible?
I'm dreaming of new benches, modern benches. Seniors have nowhere to go.
Displays at bus shelters throughout the district, and it will tell people when the next bus is due to arrive.
We're asking for a projector and 30 Mac laptops.
State-of-the-art teen fitness center.
To put solar panels on a firehouse.
After volunteers share the top projects, the community gets ready to vote.
It's a way of validating every voice in our community and saying, you know what, whatever your position is, you live in our community, you have a right to decide, and that me as a representative and government should respond and should listen to that voice. Anybody could vote in this process, immigrants, whether you're documented or not, young people that normally don't get to vote.
Most people, they don't even know that CCOs can come out here and vote today. Some of them are really surprised. They said, really? I said, yeah. They have a voice.
The projects with the most votes get funded.
The Red Hook Library Community Garden, right here.
The projects are then implemented over the next few years. And the following year, the process starts again. People brainstorm new ideas, turn them into new projects, vote on them, and fund more improvements for their community. PB becomes part of the budget process. It becomes a new way of governing.
I think this is like the greatest wave of democracy coming into the United States. It started in Porto Alegre, Brazil in 1989.
From there, it spread all over Latin America to over 1,500 cities around the world. In Toronto, public housing tenants have decided how to spend millions of dollars on improvements to their buildings. City council members in Chicago, New York, and other cities have engaged thousands of residents in allocating discretionary funds. Entire cities have launched PB, such as in Vallejo, California for funds from a sales tax, and in Boston for youth funds. Even schools and universities have used PB.
This was a great opportunity for you to be a part of government and better the city you live in. Who wouldn't want to take advantage of that?
You're creating a more educated platform of voters overall. So I think this can only be good for the big project of democracy.
So that sums up what we call participatory budgeting. And the one thing that this video didn't quite talk about is before this happens, before we go out and collect ideas, we actually go to community and form a steering committee of residents, community members that actually write the rules that will govern this process. So Pia talked about expertise, right? And if we were going to go build a building, we would go get an expert, get an architect to do that. We want it to be sound and so forth. But if we're going to design a project for community, why not go get experts to do that? Community members, folks that live in community. If we're talking about designing a youth process, like a lot of my work has been around, well, let's go get young people, young leaders to help design this process so that we do it right, so that we have some expertise at the table to do exactly that. And there's this other component, and it's how do we ensure equity and inclusion? So if we're talking about reshaping and redefining the way that we practice democracy, well, again, we have to have some things in place in order to make sure that we do it correctly. And this idea of spending a portion of a public budget, well, if it was only $5,000 of a public budget, that wouldn't be very meaningful, right? And so it has to be a pot of money that matters. If we're talking about young people, maybe it's a portion of a school budget. In the city of Boston, it was $1 million of the capital budget. In New York City, there's about $38 million of the city's capital budget that's decided on by members of the community. I mentioned expertise before, and that's really leaning into grassroots leadership to not only make sure that we're doing this right, but that we're reaching the right folks. So how often when we talk about who's left in and who's left out, and there's this perpetuated thing of the same people are always left out of these conversations, well, how do we start to break those walls down? It's by building trust. And it's also by including people that have already built trust in community. I can't be relatable to every audience, but there are folks that can be. So let's lean into that leadership to do that. And when we think about something like this, we have to build a design that allows people to participate. If we're talking about parents, for example, maybe there needs to be some thought about childcare. So if we're coming together to have a conversation, we don't want to exclude single moms or single parents. So maybe there needs to be a childcare component. If we're talking about young people, well, maybe we shouldn't meet at 10 a.m. on a Tuesday when they're in school. Maybe we should meet at a time where they can actually participate fully in the conversation. And so what does outreach look like? Again, making sure that the right people are at the table. Is that court-involved individuals, and how do we invite them into a safe space? And how do we make sure, again, that those folks that are often not included are included? And part of that is asking community, who needs to be here? And how can you help make sure that those folks are present? And then last but not least, we have to define equity together. So often in government, we think about what equity is, we make a definition, and we place that out there. But that's not how we do participatory budgeting. We do ask folks to think about three things, though. That's need, feasibility, and impact. So when we're talking about a project, is it feasible? I got an idea once. Someone said we should build a bacon room, a room made of bacon. And while this person was maybe 10 years old, and a bacon room sounds delicious, it's not exactly feasible. It's not eligible for capital funding because it won't last for at least 5 years, right? You'd eat it all. What is the need? Is there a need in community for this project? And what is the impact, and who will it impact? And so those are some of the things that we do to make sure that there's this equity lens that's applied. And so I mentioned a lot of my work has been around launching not the country's first PB effort, but the country's first youth-focused participatory budgeting effort, where young people between the ages of 12 and 25 have directly decided how $1 million of the capital budget would be spent, and it's now in its 4th year. I'm incredibly excited and proud about this, but more proud about this fact. I no longer work for the city of Boston, and this work continues. So it doesn't stop with me. It's really about institutionalizing this sort of work so that it becomes normal. Becomes the way in which we practice government, the way in which we practice democracy, the way in which community engagement takes place. I have to admit, though, we didn't start with participatory budgeting. We started with the Mayor's Youth Council. And some folks have heard of a youth commission, and I've had experiences all over the country, actually all over the world, where some youth commissions do things, and some youth councils take pictures. The Mayor's Youth Council doesn't just take pictures. They actually advise the mayor on youth-related issues. These aren't class presidents or valedictorians in some instances. They're neighborhood presidents. They're folks that really know their community. They come from diverse backgrounds and all over the city. They come together to advise the mayor, and this is standard practice, right? So we were able to transition from this idea and then to participatory budgeting with this group of folks that, again, have some trust, that are relatable to their peers. And so I think it's important to mention that component. I talked about having folks come together to form a steering committee and a diverse cross-section of individuals, which is incredibly important, to wrestle with these ideas of writing the rules of the process. And that can't just happen with me. I can't decide what all the rules of the process are. The mayor can't decide what all the rules of the process are. But we do that in collaboration so that it makes sense, and so that we're thinking of the right things when we talk about this. And I'll just mention this other thing really quickly. I just like to say this to folks as often as I can. This idea that young people are future leaders is something I have a really hard time with. I struggle with this. I think it's wrong. I think the idea that young people will lead at some point in the distant future sets us up for failure as a society. Young people can lead now. And I think Youth Lead the Change demonstrates that. And so often we're surprised by the capacity of young people. And that's part of the problem. That's part of the problem with having government having faith in community. And I could talk about young people, I could talk about community members. But this idea with support, collaboration, mentorship, this is how we build effective communities for generations to come, by including our leadership now and building those leadership skills. And so when we went out into community, and we collected ideas, thousands of ideas. We used digital platforms, but we also thought about how do we meet people where they are? Does that mean that we go to a transit station? Does that mean that we go to a school? Does that mean that we go to a sporting event? Or does that also mean that we ask community, where do we need to go? And then do they tell us, this is where you meet folks, and this is how you find the folks that are often not included in this conversation? And that's exactly what we did. This piece on wrestling with those thousands of ideas to distill them down to a proposal, to a ballot, is really difficult. And so budget delegates came together to make those really difficult conversations a reality, but also to work with city staff to price these proposals. So now, city staff members that have never interacted with a young person or have been behind this policy door are now having very real conversations with community. Again, to think about government spending priorities and community spending priorities and then see them very present on a ballot that leads to very real action. And then we go out to a citywide vote. And we have a lot of fun with that. We ask, again, where should we go? How should we design this voting process? And I'll point out really quickly, this is my good friend, Francesco. We made 10 years on Facebook today, which is also really important. Francesco is now the manager of the Mayor's Youth Council and oversees a lot of this participatory budgeting work. But you see there a contract, and that contract says, when we get to 7,000 votes, I, Francesco Tenna, will dye my hair green, and I am still working to get Francesco's hair green. But that's the kind of thing that we do. We keep this process fresh and new and utilize different components of this sort of asset-based approach where we're really building on the energy of young people. And I'll say this too, the best social media manager I've ever hired, and I used to hire 4,000 young people annually, to be clear, but the best social media manager I ever hired, young or old, was actually 17. And when Mabel would post something on social media, it would get a ton of likes, bunch of views. When I would post something, no one would see it. And I would ask Mabel, how do you do this? What is the secret sauce here? And she would say, Shari, I just feel it. I know how to talk to people in my community. And it was using that sort of leadership, this asset-based approach to community engagement, that makes participatory budgeting so successful. And so over the course of participatory budgeting in Boston in the last few years, we've collected a lot of ideas. We've seen over 100 change agents develop over 39 projects that have made it to a ballot. We've seen about 4,500 votes this year alone, and in total, 8,500 votes over the lifespan of Youth Lead the Change. Now, this is a bit outdated because we've seen nearly 20 projects funded through Youth Lead the Change at this point, whether it's laptops in schools, an app to help individuals find jobs and resources. And we've learned a lot of things. One is that technology is important, but the human elements of this process cannot be replaced with technology. So when we talk about bringing things out to the people, yes, that's going to be effective, but that can't erase this one-on-one dialogue that happens when we're building community and creating space in order to do that. It takes time to do engagement right. You can't do it in 5 minutes, especially if we're talking about some transformative process that's going to allow you to deliberate and learn things and gain skills. And then last but not least, if we're talking about making sure that folks that are not heard are at the table, we really have to engage marginalized communities. And Harvard University did a study on Youth Lead the Change, and we found out a couple things. One is that the folks that were more engaged in the process, those that developed proposals, reported some huge gains. Gains like being more likely to vote in a local or national election, feeling more confident in their skills or abilities, feeling like they could have a conversation with a local elected leader, and being able to now navigate government. So yes, we're talking about dollars and cents, but we're really talking about pathways to potentially lifelong civic engagement. So while everyone may not have the experience that I had when I was 14 years old that led me to executive leadership, while every single person can't serve on a mayor's youth council, everyone can participate in something like this. And everyone can see these gains and see government through new eyes. And then ultimately, government can change. This can become the way in which we practice government. It's a new way of governing, and that's what makes me so incredibly excited about participatory budgeting. It's this idea that there is real power that's taking place, not just a conversation. It's this idea that folks that are left out, in Vallejo, California, for example, 20% of the individuals that participated were ineligible to participate in other elections. So for many folks, this was their first time having an interaction with government that meant something. We're building stronger communities, communities, like I said before, that are reflective of generations to come and that have some ties to each other. This is a way for us to get to know our neighbors and ourselves and government even better. Their skills. I mentioned public speaking or feeling more confident in your skills. Well, maybe now folks have the ability to facilitate a conversation with their neighbors, friends, and peers about government, or maybe what's wrong with government and ways in which to make it better. Essentially, what we're talking about is walking away or building something that's more effective, fair, works better. And that's what participatory budgeting is truly all about. I just want to mention this last thing, that the Participatory Budgeting Project has a lot of really wonderful resources on our website. But most recently, we've just released a Participatory Budgeting in Schools guide, which is great. And it has lessons plans and a couple different things. Whether you're talking about PB with youth or PB in other settings, this is a great tool to get a sense of how participatory budgeting works in action. And obviously, I'm a little youth biased, so of course I threw this up there for you guys. So I'll stop there, but I just wanted to say it's been an honor and a pleasure to be here in Adelaide, and thank you so much for your time and your attention. Appreciate it.